Third essay. What is the meaning of ascetic ideals? Part 3. 20. But you will soon understand me. Putting it shortly, there is reason enough, is there not, for us psychologists nowadays never to get away from a certain mistrust of our own selves? Probably even we ourselves are still too good for our work. Probably, whatever contempt we feel for this popular craze for morality, we ourselves are perhaps none the less its victims, prey, and slaves. Probably it infects even us. Of what was that diplomat warning us when he said to his colleagues, "Let us especially mistrust our first impulses, gentlemen. They are almost always good." So should nowadays every psychologist talk to his colleagues. And thus we get back to our problem, which in point of fact does require from us a certain severity, a certain mistrust, especially against first impulses. The ascetic ideal in the service of projected emotional excess. He who remembers the previous essay will already partially anticipate the essential meaning compressed into these above 10 words. The thorough unswitching of the human soul, the plunging of it into terror, frost, ardour, rapture, so as to free it, as though some lightning shock, from all the smallness and pettiness of unhappiness, depression, and discomfort. What ways lead to this goal? And which of these ways does so most safely? At bottom all great emotions have this power, provided that they find a sudden outlet. Emotions such as rage, fear, lust, revenge, hope, triumph, despair, cruelty. And in sooth the ascetic priest has had no scruples in taking into his service the whole pack of hounds that rage in the human kennel, unleashing now these and now those, with the same constant of waking man out of his protracted melancholy, of chasing away, at any rate for a time, his dull pain, his shrinking misery, but always under the sanction of a religious interpretation and justification. This emotional excess has subsequently to be paid for, this is self-evident, and makes the ill more ill, and therefore this kind of remedy for pain is, according to modern standards, a guilty kind. The dictates of fairness, however, require that we should all the more emphasize the fact that this remedy is applied with a good conscience, that the ascetic priest has prescribed it in the most implicit belief in its utility and indispensability, often enough almost collapsing in the presence of the pain which he created, that we should similarly emphasize the fact that the violent physiological revenges of such excesses, even perhaps the mental disturbances, are not absolutely inconsistent with the general tenor of this kind of remedy, this remedy which, as we have shown previously, is not for the purpose of healing diseases, but of fighting the unhappiness of that depression, the alleviation and deadening of which was its object. The object was consequently achieved. The keynote by which the ascetic priest was enabled to get every kind of agonizing and ecstatic music to play on the fibres of the human soul was, as everyone knows, the exploitation of the feeling of guilt. I have already indicated in the previous essay the origin of this feeling, as a piece of animal psychology and nothing else. We were thus confronted with the feeling of guilt in its crude state, as it were. It was first in the hands of the priest, real artist that he was in the feeling of guilt, that it took shape. Oh, what a shape! Sin, for that is the name of the new priestly version of the animal bad conscience, the inverted cruelty, has up to the present been the greatest event in the history of the diseased soul. In sin we find the most perilous and fatal masterpiece of religious interpretation. Imagine man suffering from himself, some way or other, but at any rate physiologically, perhaps like an animal shut up in a cage, not clear as to the why and the wherefore. Imagine him in his desire for reasons. Reasons bring relief. In his desire again for remedies, narcotics at last, consulting one, who knows even with the occult, and see, lo and behold, he gets a hint from his wizard, the ascetic priest, his first hint on the cause of his trouble. He must search for it in himself, in his guiltiness, in a piece of the past. He must understand his very suffering as a state of punishment. He has heard, he has understood, has the unfortunate. He is now in the plight of a hen round which a line has to be drawn. He never gets out of the circle of lines. The sick man has been turned into the sinner. Now for a few thousand years we shall never get away from the sight of this new invalid, of a sinner. Shall we ever get away from it? Wherever we just look, everywhere the hypnotic gaze of the sinner always moving in one direction, in the direction of guilt, the only cause of suffering. Everywhere the evil conscience, the Gräulichkeit, to use Luther's language. Everywhere rumination over the past, a distorted view of action, the gaze of the green-eyed monster turning on all action. Everywhere the willful misunderstanding of suffering, its transvaluation into feelings of guilt, fear of retribution. Everywhere the scourge, the hairy shirt, the starving body, contrition. Everywhere the sinner breaking himself on the ghastly wheel of a restless and morbidly eager conscience. Everywhere mute pain, extreme fear, the agony of a tortured heart, the spasms of an unknown happiness, the shriek for redemption. In point of fact, thanks to this system of procedure, the old depression, dullness, and fatigue were absolutely conquered. Life itself became very interesting again. Awake, eternally awake, sleepless, glowing, burnt away, exhausted, and yet not tired. Such was the figure cut by man, the sinner who was initiated into these mysteries. This grand old wizard of an ascetic priest fighting with depression. He had clearly triumphed. His kingdom had come. Men no longer grumbled at pain. Men panted after pain. More pain, more pain. So for centuries on end shrieked the demands of his acolytes and initiates. Every emotional excess which hurt, everything which broke, overthrew, crushed, transported, ravished, the mystery of torture chambers, the ingenuity of hell itself, all this was now discovered, divined, exploited. All this was at the service of the wizard. All this served to promote the triumph of his ideal, the ascetic ideal. "My kingdom is not of this world," quoth he, both at the beginning and at the end. Had he still the right to talk like that? Goethe had maintained that there were only 36 tragic situations. We would infer from that, did we not know otherwise, that Goethe was no ascetic priest. He knows more. 21. So far as all this kind of priestly medicine-mongering, the guilty kind, is concerned, every word of criticism is superfluous. As for the suggestion that emotional excess of the type, which in these cases the ascetic priest is fain to order to his sick patients, under the most sacred euphemism as is obvious, and equally impregnated with the sanctity of his purpose, has ever really been of use to any sick man, who, forsooth, would feel inclined to maintain a proposition of that character. At any rate, some understanding should become as to the expression, be of use. If you only wish to express that such a system of treatment has reformed man, I do not gainsay it. I merely add that reformed conveys to my mind much as tamed, weakened, discouraged, refined, daintified, emasculated, and thus it means almost as much as injured. But when you have to deal principally with sick, depressed, and oppressed creatures, such a system, even granted that it makes the ill better, under any circumstances also makes them more ill. Ask the mad doctors the invariable result of a methodical application of penance torture, contritions, and salvation ecstasies. Similarly ask history. In every body politic where the ascetic priest has established this treatment of the sick, disease has on every occasion spread with a sinister speed throughout its length and breadth. What was always the result? A shattered nervous system, in addition to the existing malady, and this in the greatest as in the smallest, in the individuals as in the masses. We find, in consequence of the penance and redemption training, awful epileptic epidemics, the greatest known to history, such as the St. Vitus and St. John dances of the Middle Ages. We find, as another phase of its after effect, frightful mutilations and chronic depressions, by means of which the temperament of a nation or a city, Geneva, Bale, is turned once for all into its opposite. This training, again, is responsible for the witch hysteria, a phenomenon analogous to somnambulism, 8 great epidemic outbursts of this only between 1564 and 1605. We find similarly in its train those delirious death cravings of large masses, whose awful shriek, Viva la morte, was heard over the whole of Europe, now interrupted by voluptuous variations and anon by a rage for destruction. just as the same emotional sequence with the same intermittencies and sudden changes is now universally observed in every case where the ascetic doctrine of sin scores once more a great success. Religious neurosis appears as a manifestation of the devil. There is no doubt about it. What is it? Quaeritur. Speaking generally, the ascetic ideal and its sublime moral cult, this most ingenious, reckless, and perilous systematization of all methods of emotional excess, is writ large in a dreadful and unforgettable fashion on the whole history of man, and unfortunately not only on history. I was scarcely able to put forward any other element which attacked the health and rare efficiency of Europeans with more destructive power than did this ideal. It can be dubbed, without exaggeration, the real fatality in the history of the health of the European man. At the most, you can merely draw a comparison with the specifically German influence. I mean the alcohol poisoning of Europe, which up to the present has kept pace exactly with the political and racial predominance of the Germans. Where they inoculated their blood, there too did they inoculate their vice. Third in the series comes syphilis. Magno sed proximo intervallo. 22. The ascetic priest has, wherever he has obtained the mastery, corrupted the health of the soul. He has consequently also corrupted taste in artibus et litteris. He corrupts it still. Consequently? I hope I shall be granted this consequently. At any rate, I am not going to prove it first. One solitary indication, it concerns the arch book of Christian literature, the real model, their book in itself. In the very midst of the Greco-Roman splendor, which was also a splendor of books, face to face with an ancient world of writings which had not yet fallen into decay and ruin, at a time when certain books were still to be read, to possess which we would give nowadays half our literature in exchange. At that time the simplicity and vanity of Christian agitators, they are generally called fathers of the church, dared to declare, "We too have our classical literature, we do not need that of the Greeks." And meanwhile they proudly pointed to their books and legends, their letters of apostles, and their apologetic tractlets, just in the same way that today the English Salvation Army wages its fight against Shakespeare and other heathens with an analogous literature. You already guessed it, I do not like the New Testament. It almost upsets me that I stand so isolated in my tastes so far as concerns this overvalued scripture. The taste of 2,000 years is against me, but what boots it? Here I stand, I cannot help myself. I have a courage of my bad taste. The Old Testament, yes, that is something quite different. All honor to the Old Testament. I find therein great men, an heroic landscape, and one of the rarest phenomena in the world, the incomparable naivete of the strong heart. Further still, I find a people. In the New, on the contrary, just a hostel of petty sects, pure rococo of the soul, twisting angles and fancy touches, nothing but convectical air, not to forget an occasional whiff of bucolic sweetness, which appertains to the epoch and the Roman province, and is less Jewish than Hellenistic. Meekness and braggadocio cheek by jowl, an emotional garrulousness that almost deafens, passionate hysteria but no passion, painful pantomime. Here manifestly everyone lacked good breeding. How dare anyone make so much fuss about their little failings as do these pious little fellows? No one cares a straw about it, let alone God. Finally, they actually wish to have the crown of eternal life. Do all these little provincials. In return for what, in sooth? For what end? It is impossible to carry insolence any further. An immortal Peter. Who could stand him? They have an ambition which makes one laugh. The Thing dishes up cut and dried his most personal life, his melancholies, and common or garden troubles, as though the universe itself were under an obligation to bother itself about them, for it never gets tired of wrapping up God himself in the petty misery in which its troubles are involved. And how about the atrocious form of this chronic hobnobbing with God? This Jewish and not merely Jewish, slobbering and clawing importunancy towards God. There exists little despised heathen nations in East Africa, from whom these first Christians could have learnt something worth learning, a little tact in worshipping. These nations do not allow themselves to say aloud the name of their God. This seems to me delicate enough. It is certain that it is too delicate, and not only for primitive Christians. To take a contrast, just recollect Luther, the most eloquent and insolent peasant whom Germany has had. Think of the Lutheran tone, in which he felt quite the most in his element during his tete-a-tetes with God. Luther's opposition to the medieval saints of the Church, in particular against that devil's hog, the Pope, was, there is no doubt, at bottom the opposition of a boor, who was offended at the good etiquette of the Church, that worship etiquette of the sacerdotal code, which only admits to the Holy of Holies the initiated and the silent, and shuts the door against the boors. These definitely were not to be allowed a hearing in this planet, but Luther the peasant simply wished it otherwise. As it was not German enough for him. He personally wished himself to talk direct, to talk personally, to talk straight from the shoulder with his God. Well, he's done it. The ascetic ideal, you will guess, was at no time and in no place a school of good taste, still less of good manners. At the best it was a school for sacerdotal manners. That is, it contains in itself something which was a deadly enemy to all good manners. Lack of measure, opposition to measure, it is itself a non plus ultra. 23. The ascetic ideal has corrupted not only health and taste, there is also third, fourth, fifth, and sixth things which it has corrupted. I shall take care not to go through the catalogue. When should I get to the end? I have here to expose not what this ideal affected, but rather only what it means, on what it is based, what lies lurking behind it and under it, that of which it is the provisional expression, an obscure expression bristling with queries and misunderstandings. And with this object only in view, I presume not to spare my readers a glance at the awfulness of its results, a glance at its fatal results. I did this to prepare them for the final and most awful aspect presented to me by the question of the significance of that ideal. What is the significance of the power of that ideal, the monstrousness of its power? Why is it given such an amount of scope? Why is not a better resistance offered against it? The ascetic ideal expresses one will. Where is the opposition will, in which an opposition ideal expresses itself? The ascetic ideal has an aim. This goal is, putting it generally, that all the other interests of human life should, measured by its standard, appear petty and narrow. It explains epochs, nations, men, in reference to this one end. It forbids any other interpretation, any other end. It repudiates, denies, affirms, confirms, only in the sense of its own interpretation, and there, evermore a thoroughly elaborated system of interpretation. It subjects itself to no power. Rather does it believe in its own precedence over every power. It believes that nothing powerful exists in the world that has not first got to receive from it a meaning, a right to exist, a value, as being an instrument in its work, a way and means to its end, to one end. Where is the counterpart of this complete system of will, end, and interpretation? Why is the counterpart lacking? Where is the other one aim? But I am told it is not lacking, that not only has it fought a long and fortunate fight with that ideal, but that further it has already won the mastery over that ideal in all essentials. Let our whole modern science attest to this. That modern science which, like the genuine reality philosophy which it is, manifestly believes in itself alone, manifestly has the courage to be itself, the will to be itself, and has got on well enough without God, another world, and negative virtues. With all their noisy agitator babble, however, they affect nothing with me. These trumpeters of reality are bad musicians. Their voices do not come from the deeps with sufficient audibility. They are not the mouthpiece for the abyss of scientific knowledge. For today, scientific knowledge is an abyss. The word science in such trumpeter mouths is a prostitution, an abuse, and impertinence. The truth is just the opposite from what is maintained in the ascetic theory. Science has today absolutely no belief in itself, let alone in an ideal superior to itself. And wherever science still consists of passion, love, ardor, suffering, it is not the opposition to that ascetic ideal, but rather the incarnation of its latest and noblest form. Does that ring strange? There are enough brave and decent working people, even among the learned men of today, who like their little corner, and who, just because they are pleased so to do, become at times indecently loud with their demand, that people today should be quite content, especially in science, for in science there is so much useful work to do. I do not deny it. There is nothing I should like less than to spoil the delight of these honest workers in their handiwork, for I rejoice in their work. But the fact of science requiring hard work, the fact of its having contented workers, is absolutely no proof of science as a whole having today one end, one will, one ideal, one passion for a great faith. The contrary, as I have said, is the case. When science is not the latest manifestation of the ascetic ideal, but these are cases of such rarity, selectness, and exquisiteness, as to preclude the general judgment being affected thereby, science is a hiding place for every kind of cowardice, disbelief, remorse, despectio sui, bad conscience. It is the very anxiety that springs from having no ideal, the suffering from the lack of a great love, the discontent with an enforced moderation. Oh, what does all science not cover today? How much at any rate does it not try to cover? The diligence of our best scholars, their senseless industry, their burning the candle of their brain at both ends, their very mastery in their handiwork, how often is the real meaning of all that to prevent themselves continuing to see a certain thing? Science is a self-anesthetic. Do you know that? You wound them. Every one who consorts with scholars experiences this. You wound them sometimes to the quick, through just a harmless word. When you think you are paying them a compliment, you embitter them beyond all bounds, simply because you didn't have the finesse to infer the real kind of customers you had to tackle, the sufferer kind, who won't own up even to themselves what they really are, the dazed and unconscious kind who have only one fear, coming to consciousness. 24. And now look at the other side, at those rare cases of which I spoke, the most supreme idealists to be found nowadays among philosophers and scholars. Have we perchance found in them the sought-for opponents of the ascetic ideal, its anti-idealists? In fact, they believe themselves to be such, these unbelievers, for they are all of them that. It seems that this idea is their last remnant of faith, the idea of being opponents of this ideal. So earnest are they on this subject, so passionate in word and gesture. But does it follow that what they believe must necessarily be true? We knowers have grown by degrees suspicious of all kinds of believers. Our suspicion has step by step habituated us to draw just the opposite conclusions to what people have drawn before. That is to say, wherever the strength of a belief is particularly prominent, to draw the conclusion of the difficulty of proving what is believed, the conclusion of its actual improbability. We do not again deny that faith produces salvation. For that very reason we do deny that faith proves anything. A strong faith which produces happiness causes suspicion of the object of that faith. It does not establish its faith. It does establish a certain probability of illusion. What is now the position in these cases? These solitaries and deniers of today, these fanatics in one thing, in their claim to intellectual cleanness, these hard, stern, continent, heroic spirits, who constitute the glory of our time, all these pale atheists, anti-Christians, immoralists, nihilists, these skeptics, effectics, and hectics of the intellect, in a certain sense they are the latter, both collectively and individually, these supreme idealists of knowledge, in whom alone nowadays the intellectual conscience dwells and it is alive. In point of fact, they believe themselves as far away as possible from the ascetic ideal, do these free, very free spirits. And yet, if I may reveal what they themselves cannot see, for they stand too near themselves, this ideal is simply their ideal. They represent it nowadays and perhaps no one else. They themselves are its most spiritualized product, its most advanced picket of skirmishes and scouts, its most insidious, delicate, and elusive form of seduction. If I am in any way a reader of riddles, then I will be one with this sentence: for some time past there have been no free spirits, for they still believe in truth. When the Christian crusaders in the East came into collision with that invincible order of assassins, that order of free spirits par excellence, whose lowest grade lives in a state of discipline such as no order of monks has ever attained, that in some way or other they managed to get an inkling of that symbol and tally word that was reserved for the highest grade alone as their secretum. Nothing is true, everything is allowed. In sooth, that was freedom of thought, thereby was taking leave of the very belief in truth. Has indeed any European, any Christian freethinker, ever yet wandered into this proposition and its labyrinthy consequences? Does he know from experience the Minotauros of this den? I doubt it. Nay, I know otherwise. Nothing is more really alien to these mono-fanatics, these so-called free spirits, than freedom and unfettering in that sense. In no respect are they more closely tied. The absolute fanaticism of their belief in truth is unparalleled. I know all this perhaps too much from experience at close quarters, that dignified philosophic abstinence to which a belief like that binds its adherents, that stoicism of the intellect, which eventually vetoes negation as rigidly as it does affirmation, that wish for standing still in front of the actual, the factum brutum, that fatalism in petit fait, c'est petit fatalisme, as I call it, in which French science now attempts a kind of moral superiority over the German. This renunciation of interpretation generally, that is, of forcing, doctoring, abridging, omitting, suppressing, inventing, falsifying, and all the other essential attributes of interpretation. All this, considered broadly, expresses the asceticism of virtue, quite as effectively as does any repudiation of the senses. It is at bottom only a modus of that repudiation. But what forces it into that unqualified will for truth is the faith in the ascetic ideal itself. Even though it takes the form of its unconscious imperatives, makes you no mistake about it, it is the faith, I repeat, in a metaphysical value, an intrinsic value of truth, of a character which only warranted and guaranteed in this ideal. It stands or falls with this ideal. Judged strictly, there does not exist a science without its hypotheses. The thought of such a science is inconceivable, illogical. A philosophy, a faith, must always exist first to enable science to gain thereby a direction, a meaning, a limit and method, a right to existence. He who holds a contrary opinion on the subject, he, for example, who takes it upon himself to establish philosophy upon a strictly scientific basis, has first got to turn upside down not only philosophy but also the truth itself, the gravest insult which could possibly be offered to two such respectable females. Yes, there is no doubt about it. And here I quote my Joyful Wisdom, Book 5, Aphorism 344. The man who is truthful in that daring and extreme fashion, which is the presupposition of faith in science, asserts thereby a different world from that of life, nature, and history. And in so far as he asserts the existence of that different world, must he not similarly repudiate its counterpart, this world, our world? The belief on which our faith in science is based has remained to this day a metaphysical belief. Even we knowers of today, we godless foes of metaphysics, we too take our fire from that conflagration which was kindled by 1,000-year-old faith, from that Christian belief, which was also Plato's belief, the belief that God is truth, that truth is divine. But what if this belief becomes more and more incredible? What if nothing proves itself to be divine, unless it be error, blindness, lies? What if God himself proved himself to be our oldest lie? It is necessary to stop at this point and to consider the situation carefully. Science itself now needs a justification, which is not for a minute to say that there is such a justification. Turn in this context to the most ancient and the most modern philosophers. They all fail to realize the extent of the need of a justification on the part of the will to truth. Here is a gap in every philosophy. What is it caused by? Because up to the present the ascetic ideal dominated all philosophy, because truth was fixed as being, as God, as supreme court of appeal, because truth was not allowed to be a problem. Do you understand this allowed? From the minute that the belief in the God of the ascetic ideal is repudiated, there exists a new problem, the problem of the value of truth. The will for truth needed a critique. Let us define by these words our own task. The value of truth is tentatively to be called into question. If this seems too laconically expressed, I recommend the reader to peruse again that passage from the Joyful Wisdom which bears the title, How Far We Are Also Still Pious, Aphorism 344. and best of all the whole fifth book of that work, as well as the preface to Dawn of Day. 25. No, you can't get round me with science, when I search for the natural antagonists of the ascetic ideal, when I put the question, where is the opposed will in which the opponent ideal expresses itself? Science is not, by a long way, independent enough to fulfill this function. In every department, science needs an ideal value, a power which creates values, and in whose service it can believe in itself. Science itself never creates values. Its relation to the ascetic ideal is not in itself antagonistic. Speaking roughly, it rather represents the progressive force in the inner evolution of that ideal. Tested more exactly, its opposition and antagonism are concerned not with the ideal itself, but only with that ideal's outworks, its outer garb, its masquerade, with its temporary hardening, stiffening, and dogmatizing. It makes the life in the ideal free once more, while it repudiates its superficial elements. These two phenomena, science and the ascetic ideal, both rest on the same basis. I've already made this clear. The basis, I say, of the same over-appreciation of truth. More accurately, the same belief in the impossibility of valuing and of criticizing truth. And consequently they are necessarily allies, so that, in the event of their being attacked, they must always be attacked and called into question together. A valuation of the ascetic ideal inevitably entails a valuation of science as well. Lose no time in seeing this clearly, and be sharp to catch it. Art, I am speaking provisionally, for I will treat it on some other occasion in greater detail. Art, I repeat, in which lying is sanctified and the will for deception has good conscience on its side, is much more fundamentally opposed to the ascetic ideal than is science. Plato's instinct felt this. Plato, the greatest enemy of art which Europe has produced up to the present, Plato versus Homer, that is the complete, the true antagonism. On the one side, the whole-hearted transcendental, the great defamer of life. On the other, its involuntary panegyrist, the golden nature. An artistic subservience to the service of the ascetic ideal is consequently the most absolute artistic corruption that there can be, though unfortunately it is one of the most frequent phases, for nothing is more corruptible than an artist. Considered physiologically, moreover, science rests on the same basis as does the ascetic ideal. A certain impoverishment of life is the presupposition of the latter as of the former. Add frigidity of the emotions, slackening of the tempo, the substitution of dialect for instinct, seriousness impressed on mien and gesture, seriousness, that most unmistakable sign of strenuous metabolism, of struggling, toiling life. Consider the periods in a nation in which the learned man comes into prominence, that they are periods of exhaustion, often of sunset, of decay, the effervescing strength, the confidence in life, the confidence in the future are no more. The preponderance of the mandarins never signifies any good, any more than does the advent of democracy, or arbitration instead of war, equal rights for women, the religion of pity, and all the other symptoms of declining life. Science handled as a problem. What is the meaning of science? Upon this point the preface to The Birth of Tragedy. No, this modern science, mark you this well, is at times the best ally for the ascetic ideal, and for the very reason that it is the ally which is most unconscious, most automatic, most secret, and most subterranean. They have been playing into each other's hands up to the present, have these poor in spirit, and have the scientific opponents of that ideal. Take care, by the by, not to think that these opponents are the antithesis of this ideal, that they are the rich in spirit, that they are not. I have called them the hectic in spirit. As for these celebrated victories in science, there is no doubt that they are victories, but victories over what? There was not for a single minute any victory among their list over the ascetic ideal. Rather was it made stronger, that is to say, more elusive, more abstract, more insidious, from the fact that a wall, an outwork, that had got built on to the main fortress and disfigured in its appearance, should from time to time be ruthlessly destroyed and broken down by science. Does anyone seriously suggest that the downfall of the theological astronomy signified the downfall of that ideal? Has perchance man grown less in need of a transcendental solution of his riddle of existence? Because since that time this existence has become more random, casual, and superfluous in the visible order of the universe. Has there not been, since the time of Copernicus, an unbroken progress of the self-belittling of man and his will for belittling himself? Alas, his belief in his dignity, his uniqueness, and his irreplaceableness in the scheme of existence is gone. He has become animal, literal, unqualified, and unmitigated animal, he who in his earlier belief was almost God, child of God, demigod. Since Copernicus, man seems to have fallen on to a steep plane. He rolls faster and faster away from the center. Whither? Into nothingness? Into the thrilling sensation of his own nothingness? Well, this would be the straight way to the old ideal? All science, and by no means only astronomy, with regard to the humiliating and deteriorating effect of which Kant has made such a remarkable confession, it annihilates my own importance. All science, natural as much as unnatural, by unnatural I mean the self-critique of reason, nowadays sets out to talk man out of his present opinion of himself, as though that opinion had been nothing but a bizarre piece of conceit. You might go so far as to say that science finds its peculiar pride, its peculiar bitter form of stoical ataraxia, in preserving man's contempt for himself, that state which took so much trouble to bring about, as man's final and most serious claim to self-appreciation. Rightly so, in point of fact, for he who despises is always one who has not forgotten how to appreciate. But does all this involve any real effort to counteract the ascetic ideal? Is it really seriously suggested that Kant's victory over the theological dogmatism about God, soul, freedom, immortality, has damaged that ideal in any way, as the theologians have imagined to be the case for a long time past? And in this connection, it does not concern us for a single minute if Kant himself intended any such consummation. It is certain that from the time of Kant every type of transcendentalist is playing a winning game. They are emancipated from the theologians. What luck! He has revealed to them that secret art, by which they can now pursue their heart's desire, on their own responsibility, and with all the respectability of science. Similarly, who can grumble at the agnostics, reverers as they are of the unknown and the absolute mystery, if they now worship their very query as God? Xavier Doudan talks somewhere of the ravages which l'habitude d'admirer l'intelligible a lieu de rester tout simplement dans l'inconnu has produced. The ancients, he thinks, must have been exempt from those ravages. Supposing that everything known to man fails to satisfy his desires, and on the contrary contradicts and horrifies them, what a divine way out of all this to be able to look for the responsibility, not in the desiring, but in the knowing. There is no knowledge, consequently there is a God. What a novel elegantia syllogismi! What a triumph for the ascetic ideal! 26. Or perchance does the whole of modern history show in its demeanour greater confidence in life, greater confidence in its ideals? Its loftiest pretension is now to be a mirror. It repudiates all teleology. It will have no more proving. It disdains to play the judge, and thereby shows its good taste. It asserts as little as it denies, it fixes, it describes. All this is to a high degree ascetic, but at the same time it is to a much greater degree nihilistic. Make no mistake about this. You see in the historian a gloomy, hard, but determined gaze, an eye that looks out as an isolated North Pole explorer looks out, perhaps so as not to look within, so as not to look back. There is snow, here is life silenced, the last crows which caw here are called whither, vanity, nada. Here nothing more flourishes and grows, as the most the metapolitics of St. Petersburg and the pity of Tolstoy. But as for that other school of historians, a perhaps still more modern school, a voluptuous and lascivious school which ogles life and the ascetic ideal with equal fervour, which uses the word artist as a glove, and has nowadays established the corner for itself, in all the praise given to contemplation, oh, what a thirst do these sweet intellectuals excite even for ascetics and winter landscapes! Nay, the devil take these contemplative folk! How much liefer would I wandered with those historical nihilists through the gloomiest grey, cold mist. Nay, I shall not mind listening supposing I have to choose, to one who is completely unhistorical and anti-historical. A man like Dühring, for instance, over whose periods a hitherto shy and unavowed species of beautiful souls has grown intoxicated in contemporary Germany, the species anarchistica, with their educated proletariat. The contemplative are 100 times worse. I never knew anything which produced such intense nausea as one of those objective chairs, one of those scented mannequins about town of history, a thing half priest, half satyr, renon parfum, which betrays by the high, shrill falsetto of his applause what he lacks and where he lacks it, who betrays where in this case the fates have plied their ghastly shears, alas, in too surgeon-like a fashion. This is distasteful to me, and irritates my patience. Let him keep patient at such sights, who has nothing to lose thereby. Such a sight enrages me. Such spectators embitter me against the play. Even more does that play itself, history itself, you understand. Anacreontic moods imperceptibly come over me. This nature, who gave to the steer its horn, to the lion its caesu odonton. For what purpose did nature give me my foot? To kick, by Saint Anacreon, and not merely to run away. To trample on all the worm-eaten chairs, the cowardly contemplators, the lascivious eunuchs of history, the flirters with ascetic ideals, the righteous hypocrites of impotence. All reverence on my part to the ascetic ideal in so far as it is honourable, so long as it believes in itself and plays no pranks on us. But I like not all these coquettish bugs who have an insatiate ambition to smell of the infinite, until eventually the infinite smells of bugs. I like not the whited sepulchres with their stagey reproduction of life. I like not the tired and the used up who wrap themselves in wisdom and look objective. I like not the agitators dressed up and as heroes, who hide their dummy heads behind the stalking horse of an ideal. I like not the ambitious artists who would fain play the ascetic and the priest, and are at bottom nothing but tragic clowns. I like not, again, these newest speculators in idealism, the anti-Semites, who nowadays roll their eyes in the patent Christian Aryan man of honour fashion, and by an abuse of moralist attitudes and agitation dodges so cheap as to exhaust any patience, strive to excite all the blockhead elements in the populace. The invariable success of every kind of intellectual charlatanism in present-day Germany hangs together with an almost indisputable and already quite palpable desolation of the German mind, whose curse I look for in a too exclusive diet of papers, politics, beer, and Wagnerian music, not forgetting the condition precedent of this diet, the national exclusiveness and vanity, the strong but narrow principle, Germany, Germany above everything. And finally, the paralysis agitans of modern ideas. Europe nowadays is, above all, wealthy and ingenious in means of excitement. It apparently has no more crying necessity than stimulantia and alcohol. Hence the enormous counterfeiting of ideas, those most fiery spirits of the mind. Hence, too, the repulsive, evil-smelling, perjured, pseudo-alcoholic air everywhere. I should like to know how many cargoes of imitation idealism, of hero costumes with highfalutin claptrap, how many casks of sweetened pity liqueur, firm, la religion de la souffrance, how many crutches of righteous indignation for the help of those flat-footed intellects, how many comedians of the Christian moral ideal would need today to be exported from Europe to enable its air to smell pure again. It is obvious that in regard to this overproduction a new trade possibility lies open. It is obvious that there is a new business to be done in little ideal idols and obedient idealists. Don't pass over this tip. Who has sufficient courage? We have in our hands the possibility of idealizing the whole earth. But what am I talking about courage? We need only one thing here. A hand. A very free hand. 27. Enough. Let us leave these curiosities and complexities of the modern spirit, which excite as much laughter as disgust. Our problem can certainly do without them, the problem of the meaning of the ascetic ideal. What has it got to do with yesterday or today? Those things shall be handled by me more thoroughly and severely in another connection, under the title A Contribution to the History of European Nihilism. I refer for this to a work which I am preparing, The Will to Power, an attempt at a transvaluation of all values. The only reason why I come to allude to it here is this: the ascetic ideal has at times, even in the most intellectual sphere, only one real kind of enemies and damagers. These are the comedians of this ideal, for they awake mistrust. Everywhere otherwise, where the mind is at work seriously, powerfully, and without counterfeiting, it dispenses altogether now with an ideal. The popular expression for this abstinence is atheism, with the exception of the will for truth. But this will, this remnant of an ideal is, if you will believe me, that ideal itself in its severest and cleverest formulation, esoteric through and through, stripped of all outworks, and consequently not so much its remnant as its kernel. Unqualified honest atheism, and its air only do we breathe, we, the most intellectual men of this age, is not opposed to that ideal, to the extent that it appears to be. It is rather one of the final phases of its evolution, one of its syllogisms and pieces of inherent logic. It is the awe-inspiring catastrophe of a 2,000-year training in truth, which finally forbids itself the lie of the belief in God. The same course of development in India, quite independently and consequently of some demonstrative value, the same ideal driving to the same conclusion, the decisive point reached 500 years before the European era, or more precisely at the time of Buddha. It started in the Sankhya philosophy, and then this was popularized through Buddha, and made into a religion. What? I put the question with all strictness, has really triumphed over the Christian God? The answer stands in my joyful wisdom, aphorism 357. The Christian morality itself, the idea of truth, taken as it was with increasing seriousness, the confessor subtlety of the Christian conscience, translated and sublimated into the scientific conscience, into intellectual cleanness at any price, regarding nature as though it were a proof of the goodness and guardianship of God, interpreting history in honor of a divine reason as a constant proof of a moral order of the world and a moral teleology, explaining our own personal experiences, as pious men have for long enough explained them, as though every arrangement, every nod, every single thing were invented and sent out of love for the salvation of the soul. All this is now done away with. All this has the conscience against it, and is regarded by every subtler conscience as disreputable, dishonorable, as lying, feminism, weakness, cowardice. By means of this severity, if by means of anything at all, are we, in sooth, good Europeans, and heirs of Europe's longest and bravest self-mastery. All great things go to ruin by reason of themselves, by reason of an act of self-dissolution. So wills the law of life, the law of necessary self-mastery, even in the essence of life. Ever is the lawgiver finally exposed to the cry, patere legem quam ipse tulisti. In thus wise did Christianity go to ruin as a dogma, through its own morality. In thus wise must Christianity go again to ruin today as a morality. We are standing on the threshold of this event. After Christian truthfulness has drawn one conclusion after another, it finally draws its strongest conclusion, its conclusion against itself. This, however, happens when it puts the question, what is the meaning of every will for truth? And here again do I touch on my problem, on our problem, my unknown friends. For as yet I know of no friends. What sense has our whole being, if it does not mean that in our own selves that will for truth has come to its own consciousness as a problem? By reason of this attainment of self-consciousness on the part of the will for truth, morality from henceforward, there is no doubt about it, goes to pieces. This is that great 100-act play that is reserved for the next 2 centuries of Europe, the most terrible, the most mysterious, and perhaps also the most hopeful of all plays. 28. If you accept the ascetic ideal, man, the animal man, has no meaning. His existence on earth contained no end. What is the purpose of man at all? Was a question without an answer. The will for man and the world was lacking. Behind every great human destiny rang as a refrain a still greater vanity. The ascetic ideal simply means this, that something was lacking, that a tremendous void encircled man. He did not know how to justify himself, to explain himself, to affirm himself. He suffered from the problem of his own meaning. He suffered also in other ways. He was in the main a diseased animal. But his problem was not suffering itself, but the lack of an answer to that crying question: to what purpose do we suffer? Man, the bravest animal and the one most inured to suffering, does not repudiate suffering in itself. He wills it, he even seeks it out, provided that he is shown a meaning for it, a purpose for suffering. Not suffering, but the senselessness of suffering was the curse which till then lay spread over humanity, and the ascetic ideal gave it a meaning. It was up till then the only meaning, but any meaning is better than no meaning. The ascetic ideal was in that connection the faute de mieux par excellence that existed at that time. In that ideal, suffering found an explanation. The tremendous gap seemed filled. The door to all suicidal nihilism was closed. The explanation, there is no doubt about it, brought in its train new suffering, deeper, more penetrating, more venomous, gnawing more brutally into life. It brought all suffering under the perspective of guilt. But in spite of that, man was saved thereby. He had a meaning, and from henceforth was no more like a leaf in the wind, a shuttlecock of chance, of nonsense. He could now will something, absolutely immaterial to what end, to what purpose, with what means he wished. The will itself was saved. It is absolutely impossible to disguise what, in point of fact, is made clear by